You are safe here, I promise. Nod if you understand me.
The monitors continued their steady beeping. An 4 pump clicked softly beside the bed. Behind the glass, doctors and military personnel watched with alarm as the heavily built Navy veteran stared at the young nurse with an expression nobody could understand. Then the nurse did something that made several people laugh. She slowly lowered her hands, took a small whiteboard from the supply cart, and wrote 5 words in large letters. "You are safe with me." The veteran looked at the words. His hardened face changed. And what happened next would make everyone in that hospital ashamed of what they had assumed about both of them. If you believe kindness can change a person's life, and that everyone deserves a second chance before being judged, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. It was just after 2 a.m. at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia, when 26-year-old Hannah Whitmore began her first overnight shift as a newly licensed emergency nurse. She had dreamed about becoming a nurse since she was a child, but dreams looked very different when you were standing inside a trauma bay with alarms screaming and experienced nurses moving around you as if they had been born knowing exactly what to do. Hannah was intelligent, compassionate, and hardworking, but she was still new. Her hands sometimes trembled when the pressure became overwhelming, and she had not yet learned how to hide her nervousness behind the calm expression expected from an emergency room professional. That night, an ambulance arrived carrying a man who had been injured in a highway accident outside Norfolk. The paramedics had identified him as Caleb Mercer, 39, former Navy SEAL, decorated combat veteran, and medically retired after injuries sustained overseas. His military record was impressive enough that several people in the hospital recognized his name before he even reached the trauma bay. Caleb had survived multiple deployments, but an explosion years earlier had left him profoundly deaf. He communicated primarily through American Sign Language and written notes, and when overwhelmed, he sometimes became completely unresponsive to people around him. Unfortunately, the hospital's overnight staff had not been informed about his communication needs before he arrived. Caleb was conscious, but confused and frightened. His shoulder was badly injured, his ribs were bruised, and there was a deep cut near his temple. The accident had caused no life-threatening internal bleeding, but the pain and disorientation had pushed him into a defensive state. When one of the technicians approached quickly from behind, Caleb instinctively turned and grabbed the man's arm. The technician pulled away. Several people immediately assumed the worst. Hannah didn't. She noticed something everyone else seemed to miss. Caleb wasn't trying to attack anyone. He was trying to understand what was happening. He couldn't hear the alarms. He couldn't hear footsteps approaching behind him. He couldn't hear nurses explaining procedures. Every sudden movement was a surprise. Hannah had taken an introductory American Sign Language course during nursing school because she had always believed that communication should never depend entirely on hearing. She wasn't fluent, but she remembered enough signs to recognize that Caleb was asking what was happening. She moved slowly into his line of sight. That was when 2 senior nurses exchanged amused looks. One whispered that Hannah had been at the hospital for less than a month and was already trying to teach a decorated war hero how to behave. Another joked that perhaps the rookie thought she was some kind of military therapist. Hannah heard them. She ignored them. Instead, she picked up a whiteboard. Her first message was simple. "My name is Hannah. I am your nurse." Caleb stared at it. Then Hannah wrote another sentence. "I will tell you before I touch you." Something changed in his eyes. The muscles around his jaw loosened. He nodded once. For the next 20 minutes, Hannah communicated with him through a combination of basic signs, writing, gestures, and eye contact. Before checking his blood pressure, she pointed toward his arm. Before adjusting his fore, she showed him what she was doing. Before the doctor examined his shoulder, she made sure Caleb could see the doctor's face. It was basic nursing. But to Caleb, it meant something much deeper. Someone was finally allowing him to feel in control of his own body. Then the attending physician entered the room. Dr. Marcus Bennett was an experienced trauma specialist who had worked at St. Catherine's for nearly 15 years. He was confident, respected, and accustomed to being obeyed immediately. He looked at Caleb's chart, then at Hannah, then at the whiteboard. He asked why they were wasting time communicating with a patient who could simply be sedated. Hannah explained that Caleb was stable and that she believed sedation was unnecessary. The room became uncomfortable. A rookie nurse was disagreeing with a senior physician. Hannah could feel everyone's eyes on her. But she didn't back down. She pointed out that Caleb had already survived trauma that had permanently affected his hearing and that sudden contact could trigger a defensive response. If they gave him information before touching him, they might prevent another reaction. Dr. Bennett reluctantly agreed. But several staff members quietly laughed. To them, Hannah was simply inexperienced. To Caleb, she was the first person in hours who had treated him like a human being instead of a problem. Then something unexpected happened. Caleb reached toward the whiteboard. His hands were shaking. He wrote slowly. "Where is my brother?" Hannah looked at his chart. There was no brother listed as an emergency contact. She asked him to explain. Caleb wrote that his younger brother, Nathan, had been driving behind him when the accident happened. He hadn't seen Nathan after the crash. Hannah immediately asked the paramedics. They explained that Caleb had been traveling alone. Nathan had not been at the scene. Hannah gently wrote that his brother was not listed among the patients brought in. Caleb stared at the sentence for a long time. Then his shoulders dropped. The tough Navy veteran who had survived combat suddenly looked like a frightened little boy. Hannah pulled a chair beside his bed. She didn't tell him to be strong. She didn't tell him that everything would be fine. She simply stayed. For the next several minutes, she sat beside him while he cried silently. Nobody in the trauma bay laughed anymore. Around 3:15 a.m., Caleb was moved to a quieter room for observation. Hannah remained his assigned nurse. She continued checking on him, explaining every procedure before doing it, and making sure the lights weren't changed suddenly. At 4 a.m., she noticed something strange. Caleb had stopped looking at her. He was staring at an old military identification bracelet around his wrist. Hannah asked if it was important. He nodded. Then he wrote something that made her heart stop. "She gave me this." Hannah asked who. Caleb hesitated. Then he wrote, "The woman who saved my life." Hannah assumed he meant another service member. She asked if that person was still alive. Caleb shook his head. Then he wrote, "I don't know her name." Hannah didn't understand. Caleb began explaining through a series of written sentences. Years earlier, during an overseas mission, Caleb's unit had come under heavy fire. Their vehicle had been struck, trapping several soldiers inside. Caleb had suffered severe injuries and lost consciousness. When he woke briefly, a woman was kneeling beside him. She wasn't wearing a military uniform. She wasn't wearing a helmet. She was a civilian medical worker who had entered the danger zone to help the wounded. Caleb remembered almost nothing about her face. But he remembered her hands. He remembered her writing something on a scrap of cloth because he couldn't hear her. "You are safe." She had stayed with him until evacuation arrived. Then she disappeared. Caleb had spent years trying to find her. He never did. Hannah stared at the words. There was something strangely familiar about the story. She asked what happened to the woman. Caleb wrote that she had been injured during the rescue. He believed she might have died. Then he added another sentence. She had a small scar here. He pointed toward his own left wrist. Hannah froze. Her breathing changed. She slowly pulled back the sleeve of her scrubs. There was a faint scar across her wrist. Caleb stared at it. His eyes widened. Hannah suddenly remembered something she had almost forgotten. When she was 18, her mother had worked with an international humanitarian medical organization. Hannah had traveled with her for part of one summer. During an emergency evacuation, Hannah had helped a group of injured people before being sent away from the danger zone. She had been young, terrified, and she had never known what happened afterward. Her mother had always told her that one of the injured soldiers survived because of her. But Hannah had never known his name. She had never known he became a Navy SEAL. She had never known he spent years looking for her. Caleb slowly reached for the whiteboard. His hands trembled as he wrote 3 words. It was you. Hannah couldn't move. The room seemed to disappear around them. The beeping monitors faded into the background. The nurses who had laughed earlier gathered near the doorway. Dr. Bennett stepped forward. Caleb looked toward him, then toward the others. He lifted the whiteboard. On it, he wrote, "She saved me." Then he pointed directly at Hannah. Nobody laughed. The senior nurse who had mocked Hannah earlier covered her mouth. Another nurse began crying. Dr. Bennett looked down at the floor. But Caleb wasn't finished. He wrote another sentence. "I survived because she told me I was safe." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. She told him that she hadn't remembered him. Caleb smiled through his tears. Then he wrote, "I remembered you." Those 4 words broke something inside Hannah. Because she suddenly understood that sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the largest memory in another person's life. She had thought that night overseas was insignificant. She had thought she had merely done what anyone should do. But Caleb had carried that moment for years. While he had been fighting nightmares, surgeries, hearing loss, and memories of war, he had also carried the memory of a frightened young woman who refused to leave him alone in the darkness. And now, years later, that same woman had unknowingly walked into his hospital room and offered him exactly what she had given him the first time. Safety. Not medication. Not pity. Not fear. Safety. The hospital administrator later reviewed the incident and discovered that Hannah's quick communication had prevented Caleb from being unnecessarily restrained or sedated. Her approach was praised by the medical team, but Hannah refused to accept the attention. She said she had simply done what nursing was supposed to mean. See the person. Understand the fear. And never make someone feel alone. Caleb eventually underwent surgery for his shoulder and recovered steadily. Before he was discharged, he gave Hannah the military bracelet he had worn for years. She tried to refuse it. He insisted. Inside the bracelet was a tiny engraving Caleb had added after his deployment. "Someone saw me when I couldn't hear the world." Hannah cried when she read it. Months later, Caleb returned to St. Catherine's. Not as a patient. As a visitor. He brought a framed photograph of himself from his military service and a letter written entirely by hand. He asked the hospital to place it in the nursing education center. The letter said that the greatest lesson he had learned from war was not how to survive bullets, explosions, or fear. It was that sometimes survival depended on one person choosing to be gentle when everyone else chose to be impatient. Hannah eventually became one of the hospital's strongest advocates for deaf and hard of hearing patients. She helped create a communication protocol so that future patients would never have to fight to be understood. And Caleb? He became one of her closest friends. They didn't need many words. Sometimes he would visit the hospital and simply raise his hand in greeting. Hannah would smile and sign back. "You are safe." Years after that first night, Caleb told her that those were the words he had needed most during the darkest moments of his life. Not because they promised that nothing bad would happen, but because they reminded him that he didn't have to face it alone. And perhaps that is what kindness really is. It isn't always grand. It doesn't always make the news. Sometimes kindness is a rookie nurse sitting beside a frightened veteran at 2 in the morning. Sometimes it's learning how to communicate with someone who communicates differently. Sometimes it's refusing to laugh when everyone else is laughing. And sometimes, the person you think you're helping for 5 minutes is actually carrying your kindness for the rest of their life. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes that compassion still matters, and subscribe so more stories like this can reach people who need a little hope. And before you go, comment, "Kindness can heal," if you believe one small act of compassion can change someone's entire life. Because Hannah thought she was only comforting a wounded stranger. She never knew that years earlier, she had already saved him. And Caleb had never forgotten the woman who stayed beside him in the darkness and made him believe, even for one precious moment, that he was safe.